Did you know that the forgotten founder of Zionism went on to play a leading role in Agudas Yisrael, or that Rav Chatzkel Abramsky was responsible for the continued presence of the Muslim Waqf on Har HaBayis? It turns out that the margins of history tell the real story. Behind the Times dives into the big concepts and overlooked moments that carry vast meaning, all through the lens of Torah and rabbinic thought. Behind the Times, with Rabbi Efraim Zalman Galinsky and Gedalia Guttentag. Evening was approaching when, coming from Radin, we arrived at the wooden hut which served as the summer home of the Chofetz Chaim, the acknowledged greatest rabbinical sage of our time. Walking through the smoke-filled kitchen of the cottage, we stepped into a small room. We were standing now before the 92-year-old sage, of small stature, wearing a black silk robe, a black summer cap on his head, sitting in an armchair. A spark of real joy came over his face with our arrival. With subdued satisfaction, he said, "Shalom Aleichem" to you. And then we approached, each one of us offering him our hand. Strangely enough, every one of the guests bent over the Chofetz Chaim's hand in humility and kissed it. What was it that made us feel so solemn? We are used to holding our heads rather high. How did it come about that in the nearness of this man, all of us suddenly became humble, self-conscious, and yet elevated? Everyone was keenly aware we were standing before the single greatest halachic authority of our time. Still, there was another element which had a powerful effect. Though none of the conditions which stir the senses were present, no resounding speech, not even an extraordinarily intricate thought, that in itself was what made such an overwhelming impact. No adornments, just humanity, pure and simple. That, my dear Rabbi Efraim Zalman Galinsky, is one of the most extraordinary descriptions of Gadlus that I've ever encountered.
I happen to agree, Rabbi Gedalia.
And where does this come from, Rabbi Efraim? It comes from a group. This were the words of Rav Yosef Tzvi Carlebach, the scion of the famous Carlebach dynasty, who was later killed in the war. Last Rav of Ahu, Altona, Hamburg, and Wandsbek. And these words appear in his remarkable diary of the 1929 Keren HaTorah study tour, which brought a whole group of sophisticated German rabbis and intellectuals to a journey across the Hassidic and Litvish worlds and the worlds of Eastern Europe. The reason I selected this for our pre-Shavuos or Shavuos episode of Behind the Times is that I have never seen such compelling analysis of what Gedolim are. I've never seen such a compelling contemporary account of the loftiness of the pre-war yeshivas, of the beauty of learning Torah, and it's really an ode or a song in the very, as we're going to see later, in this diary of Yosef Tzvi Carlebach.
And I want you to address, while you're mentioning it, that what was missing in Germany. I mean, he was a Talmid Chacham, right? And there was a yeshiva in Germany, and they probably learned at a high level. But what was missing? Like, what did he feel?
I think we're going to be able to see in his own words later what it was and the value in this little known. And I'll just say for listeners, this diary is printed in a book by his son, by Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Carlebach's son, Rav Shlomo Carlebach, who's not the Shlomo Carlebach the singer, was a cousin. The book is in English called Ish Yehudi, the life
who originally
and legacy.
was the Mashgiach in Chaim Berlin.
Who Shlomo Carlebach. Lived just a few years ago.
Right, and he was a tremendous Baal Machshava. I want you to know that while I was learning in Hebron 30-some odd years ago, they used to bring to the yeshiva these like kuntrasim of Reb Shlomo Carlebach. Right, it was called Mizmor Shlomo, I think, and it's beautiful stuff. It's really Divrei Machshava, very beautiful. I think they reprinted after he passed away. They reprinted something like that. So I think primarily, Efraim, what I want to see over here is just to let this song of the Torah come out. It's so beautiful, just on its own, doesn't need any commentary. But there's another point over here, which is that I think that in this meeting between the two worlds, and we're going to get into why indeed this was, how different these worlds were, and that will become obvious. But I think we see the seeds of our world, because our world today is
people like to think it's just the regeneration of the old pre-war Eastern European world. That is emphatically not the case. It is a melding of the pre-war different Jewish worlds, different frum worlds that made up that great disparate Jewish world. And I think I'd like to explore that. Okay, I think, Rabbi Efraim, the best jumping off point is just to acknowledge what it was the situation before the war when it involved the yeshivas of Lita and everywhere else. Because today, for example, here in Eretz Yisrael, they talk about Chutz La'aretz. Back before the war, the Chutz La'aretz was not Eretz Yisrael, that was not the center of the Torah world. It was Lithuania and bits of Poland, and everywhere else was Chutz La'aretz. In the sense that, what I mean by that is that people did come. Americans came to Lithuania, right? We had a few from England, we had from Germany, we had from different parts from Western Europe, and they would come to grow. And some of those
reminds us of Bavel of old, right? Everyone coming to Bavel,
as in like there was a Torah center,
Gainim, right?
Correct. There was, and right through history, there's been times when the Torah center was in Germany. There's been times when the Torah center was in France. The Torah center has moved Russia, Poland, different places. It was Lithuania largely before the war, at least when it came to what is known classically as the yeshiva world. And we know they weren't the only Germans to go that direction that time. But in 1929, remember, a lot of what we know as, for example, Rav Shlomo Wolber was to come from Frankfurt, or Rav Shimon Schwab was to come as well. And there was a very strong traffic, but that seems to be more in the 1930s, I think. And so 1929 was early, and it was a kind of opening up of different worlds to each other.
There's one point that you have to try to explain to the listeners, and that is the influence of German Jewry on things happening to the Jewish world in general. Because today, if you're going to tell someone in the street that from the yeshiva, yeshiva bacher, and you say like German Jewry was like playing a central role, right? It Pasha doesn't make sense because today we're in a situation where German Jewry is
well, it's essentially
no
Russian-speaking German Jewry and a post-Kirov situation. Agreed. And I think it's very important to understand that the effect of what had happened was like this. The German Jewry, going back in the generation of Shimshon Val Hirsch, the early to mid-19th century, German Jewry experienced what I would call a near-death experience. It was the center of the Torah had been literally in the land called Ashkenaz. And what had happened then was that Reform had mounted an assault, such a successful onslaught, that they created a situation where this ancient center of Torah, Reform ruled. They closed down mikvahs. They closed down chadorim. They legally took over what the government recognized as the Jewish community and created a situation there was almost nothing left. The neo-orthodoxy, I suppose it's called, of Rav Shimshon Val Hirsch, and there were others of his time, right, great rabbanim of his time, they fought back, they created individual communities, or whether they did or they didn't separate from the overall community structure in a process known as Auschwitz, but whatever it was, they created a new orthodoxy. Now, when you have, I suppose you could, if we're starting with the imagery of death or near-death experience, let's continue like this. If you have a disease that nearly kills a patient, but the patient survives,
he's much stronger.
He's much stronger. When it comes to that particular disease, it won't get him. What had happened was that German Jewry had figured out a whole...
how to deal with modernity.
How to deal with modernity. And by the way, that is the power, the unique theme of Rav Shimshon Val Hirsch's writings, in that he is the one writing and giving the hashkafa of that the Torah can overcome the Western modernity. He was the one.
We must stress over here, right? The entire Beis Yaakov movement was an outcome of Rav Hirsch's approach to Yiddishkeit.
Correct.
How was that? Because Sarah Schneer was listening to Shurim by a local Rav in Vienna, and he was a Talmud Rav Hirsch, and this is where she was inspired to take these ideas and give it over to the Jewish girls all over Europe. Right, you have to understand in those days, and I had a grandmother who's nifter at the age of 104, and she grew up in Krakow. Yeah, and you have to understand that even
she was a Talmida.
No, she wasn't a Talmida, but she grew up in that generation. Yeah, and she remembers like even the daughters of the great Hasidic rabbis. Were falling away.
Wow,
because there was no structure for Jewish education for girls.
Mm-hmm. So they were the intelligent ones were going out to
And
the local public library.
They were aristocratic,
Yep.
these daughters of these great rabbis. And Rahman al-San, they were hanging out with Goyish aristocrats. And the continuation is understood. What will that lead to?
Wow.
Right? And this saved like a whole chunk of Yiddishkeit in Europe. So Rav Hirsch at the end played a very major role in the survival of East European Jewry.
So let's get back to that later, because I want to just talk towards the end about there were more components of Efraim than that. It wasn't just an educational philosophy, and it was habits of community and of Torah life. He created new habits, new institutions, and new ways of doing things that we accept totally for not, as usual nowadays, meaning we just take it for granted nowadays.
That's how it was.
Exist.
Right.
But no, these habits of mind go back to that battle, that rearguard action fought by Rav Hirsch, and the battle successfully won. And that is the background that I think to understand what had happened, because in the process, neo-orthodoxy in the Germanic model looked very different. I think it was Rameir Shapiro who went to the Rav Hirsch's community, where his son-in-law was the Rav, the Rav Shlomo Breuer, and he'd seen earlier in the day the someone had taken him around Frankfurt, and it was, Western Europe. Germany was a very advanced place compared to anywhere in the world at the time. In the 30s, it would have been in the late 20s. And Rameir Shapiro, they showed him there's a new thing called ice cream. Oh, it's very interesting. So later on, they took him to Rav Hirsch's community, or his son-in-law's community, Galadas Yishurin then, and they showed him, and he davened there. And afterwards, he was asked, if I'm not mistaken, what did you think of it? He said, it's like ice cream. It's very tasty, but very cold.
Wow.
that is, if I'm not mistaken, that is the thing. And by the way, I'll just add another thing. I think it was the Ponevezher Rav who was asked about, if I'm not going to make my facts wrong as well, he's a pre-war, very famous Rav, and he was asked when Shlomo Breuer, who was Dr. Solomon Breuer, when his Rav Hirsch's son-in-law was nifta, and there was a struggle, kind of a competition, who's going to be the next Rav, and they asked the Ponevezher Rav to be the thing, and he said an unforgettable line, came up with an unforgettable line. He said in Yiddish, "Sie sind noch krank, und sie darf haben a doctor." The Western European Jews, the extra Jews, are still ill, and they need a doctor.
Wow.
In other words, they need a rabbi doctor. They're not ready for a real Rav in the old style, because they've got caught up with, they need secular education, and they're Rabbonim, and those who know the great Yekish Rabbonim, after even those who rebuilt German Jewry and Yekishkeit elsewhere. There was Rav Munk in London. He had a degree in what else? William Wordsworth, the poetry of Wordsworth, right? And there was this insistence until just a few years ago, until, for example, the last generation of Rabbonim in Washington Heights and in London, there was an insistence that they have, where's your academic degree? And that was the resonance of the Ponevezher Rav's remark. He said, you've built something remarkable. You've saved Yiddishkeit, but they're still ill. They need a doctor.
But there's something that we're missing over here, okay?
Yeah.
And this is the reason why they played a role in this story that we're talking about, the Keren Torah, is because historically at that Kufa, Germany was at its peak.
Yeah.
And it's like it's equal to where America is today.
Correct.
And that is why all this emanated from Germany. They're like coming from the place that has the money, that has the power, and has the
organizational
and the skills.
The Askonim developed their skills, and we're going to see. So I think, Rabbi Efraim, we can jump with that introduction. I think we can jump straight into a few just absolutely beautiful scenes. Whether you agree or not with the rest of the analysis, they stand on their own. First of all, Agudas Yisrael, so the Keren HaTorah, was a major international fundraising rescue effort that began after the First World War, because there was collapse of the whole economic model that had underpinned the yeshivas and Torah, and it had collapsed. And so then the Aguda had to look not each yeshiva for itself, but altogether itself. And what happened was, someone had an idea in 1929. Agudas Yisrael's Keren HaTorah initiative under Dr. Leo Deutschlander took place. Officially, Rabbi Efraim, what this journey was a study mission. It was a delegation of leading Western European rabbonim and journalists and community figures. They were traveling through the great Torah centers of
I'm
Eastern
assuming
Europe.
that we're talking about all from.
They were all from.
All from, right.
Absolutely. This was
modern, but from, right.
They were
right.
under the Aguda auspices.
Right, for sure, 100%.
And their purpose was, it was a fact-finding mission. Like, you're going to send, in other words, these people all are influential. They've got Balabatim back home. They might control a fund or whatever it is. And they want to see for themselves, what is it they're supporting over here? And at the head of the group stood Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Carlebach, who was then emerging as one of the leading figures of German Orthodoxy. And he was, I think it's worth saying who he was, because the Carlebach name is a very iconic name and continues to have major Talmidei Chacham associated with it. The father of this clan was Rabbi Dr. Salomon Shlomo Carlebach, who was the Rav of Lübeck. Now, Lübeck's in the German north, near the Baltic, I think near the Baltic or somewhere around there, and in Hamburg. And he was if you see pictures of Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, the original one, he was a tremendous rabbinic presence. Not, interestingly enough, didn't look like the standard clean kind of Spitzbord type of German Rav. He was full-bearded, tall literature kappel and yarmulke. He had a whole lot of sons, about half of whom became rabbonim. In that final generation, German rabbinic generation before the Holocaust, about 5 of them were Carlebach, and they were supported in turn by some of the others. For example, I think one of the other brothers became a banker. He was wealthy, supported his brother's effort. And they were all sorts of, in the Hirschian way, you had the rabbis and the doctors, and they were all, and sometimes at the same time. But crucially, the father was very close and for some reason had links to Gedalia of Eastern Europe, and there's a correspondence between them. So there was this connection. And just to carry on from that point, that 2 of his children, 2 of Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Carlebach's children, one of them Yosef Tzvi, and the other one I think was Rabbi Manuel Carlebach. Both of them were chaplains in the German army during the First World War, and they were instrumental in the First World War in saving Polish Jewry, working hand in hand with the Imre Emes, the Ger Rebbe, to streamline and professionalize.
He was positioned in Eastern Europe.
Yes, he was part of the German government of occupation, but he was a chaplain for the army whose Siyata D'Shmaya was able to win favor with the generals and basically shunt to the side the reform Jewish leadership who were being consulted. Remember, in the First World War, the Germans spent 3 or 4 years in Poland, occupied it. They had a chance to revolutionize everything, and they tried to. And under the reform rabbis who were allied with the German occupation authorities, there was the idea that they're going to destroy the Cheder system as backward and primitive. And it was literally Gezeras.
And he stood in their way.
And
That's
the 2 brothers were able to made contact with, I don't remember how it goes, together with another Chashver German Rav, whose name I forget, who they were able to win the confidence of the German authorities. And they had the confidence because they walked the walk and talked the talk. They were clearly university-trained, sophisticated people. And this was something that the German authorities, that was how you qualified. If you didn't have those credentials, you couldn't get in the door. And they were able...
That is very interesting, that 2 German rabbis enabled continuity of authentic Jewish life in Poland.
Yes, it's a very big
between
story.
The 2 world wars.
It's a very big story, and the relationship, I've written about it years ago. And after I did, the story of these 2 brothers, focusing on the 2 brothers, and this after I did, somebody made contact, and he said, yes, we're descendants, and we have the kos given by the Imre Emes to our grandfather. And yeah, it's a story, and Yeshivudi speaks extensively about it, the book over here, and it's a wonderful thing. But anyway, so that was the background to the mission. Who was on this mission? So names, Rabbi Efraim, I think you'd be familiar with Rabbi Dr. Leo Jung of New York.
That's a big name, okay? Rabbi Leo Jung, I think that's the way you pronounce it, right?
Yeah.
Even though it's written Jung.
Yeah, well, it's pronounced as Jung. He was an uncle of my wife's grandfather. So he was an uncle of the Rothschilds from Zurich. So he was a very
He had a lot of influence in America. Yeah. He was very charismatic, and
so bringing him along, Rabbi Efraim, was a very savvy move because it enabled them to tap in. The yeshiva suddenly were able to tap into funding from Manhattan funding.
I'm wondering if it's because of that he became one of the prime sources of funding for the Beis Yaakov movement.
Very interesting. This is maybe the link. Who else? There was names I'm less familiar with over here. As you say, he was as chairman of the American Beis Yaakov Committee, etc. But there were others such as the Dr. Adolf Deutsch of Budapest, Professor Aladar Fürst from across Germany. I looked up this name and never heard it, but you actually see these academics are still The internet hasn't forgotten them. And they were from from Germany, from Hungary, Holland, and Austria, different parts as well. And what they happened is, and there's beautiful pictures in this book, Ishuhudi, you see that all the Yekas there in their traveling clothes, the soft cloth caps, and the literally traveling clothes of the late 1920s. And they're traveling by car through the rough roads of Poland. Can you imagine how bad they were? Right, Poland, Galicia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Hungary, parts of this were very underdeveloped, parts of Eastern Europe. And they visited nearly 40 places in 17 cities, including Lublin, Vilna, Radin, and Pressburg. Now, actually, that's interesting. They got Slovakia, right, so Pressburg is in Slovakia. So they weren't just going for the literature worlds, they were going to literature and Hassidic,
Hungarian.
and also Hungarian worlds. And the pictures from that, are just meetings of worlds, very evocative over that. Rabbi Efraim, let me just quote over here. Let's begin to quote him because the diary here is so rich over here. These are the records of Rabbi Yosef Carlebach, and he says like this: was it a summertime excursion or a study tour, an exploration trip or a visit to the centers of Torah, a pilgrimage or a religious service? What indeed was this event orchestrated by the Keren Torah, which brought together 20 people from 7 different countries, representing 15 different professions? I love that very Yekish touch. To saunter across Czechoslovakia, Galicia, Poland, and Lithuania, from Vienna to Vilna. It was all of these and more. And like everything precious and genuine, it achieved beyond all initial aims. It was a total novelty in Jewish communal life, and this is beautiful. The brothers' journey to seek out brothers and to see them. Thus the journey assumed a symbolic character. It became a harbinger of kibbutz galuyos, of the great reunion and recognition of those who belong together.
So saying beyond the practical purpose of the mission, the fact that they were meeting each other was an importance of itself.
Correct. And I think that's a very good expression of what's happening here. It's a meeting of worlds. And as we said, remember how separate these are. The German Western European experience, now fundamentally different from life in Eastern Europe. And I think, Rabbi Efraim, it's fair to say that after the war, after the Holocaust, you're getting the rebuilding of the frum world. These worlds didn't disappear, but they live side by side. In Flatbush, you go to the Yeshiva of Flatbush, a Modern Orthodox institution, which is down the road from Chaim Berlin, which is, right, and you're seeing across. People are not geographically separated by hundreds of miles and different state borders. These worlds have melded more.
But the ideals are still there.
The ideals, that's what I'm saying. The ideals are still there, but they exist. You might
side by side.
You could daven shacharis with the Yekas, after mincha with the Yeshivish in the yeshiva, and go for Mariv and Satmar. You know what I'm saying? And it's easy. You could do it all within half an hour's driving. In most places in the world, that remains true. But what is so novel about this was that these worlds were meeting genuinely for the first time. And Rabbi Efraim, I think what we're about to see is on our first stop, the visit to Rabbi Meir Shapiro. And let's go ahead. Do you want to go ahead and quote?
I'm wondering that Rabbi Meir Shapiro, they probably knew him from his trips abroad. He was someone who fundraised all over the world. I'm really doubting if this is the first time they're meeting him in his
Yes, I don't know when he
place,
came
right.
to. I don't know when he came. As I said, he did come to Frankfurt, etc. I don't know.
Came to America. He was in America
right.
for
he had to fundraise through the 20s for his yeshiva. I think
right.
it was opened in the early 30s. And let's just read this extract over here because it's really beautiful. And then it's just comments over here. At the table in the yeshiva Chachmei Lublin, we were joined by a very large number of students of the yeshiva, as well as many admirers from neighboring cities who had come to honor the guests of the special Shabbos. The Lubliner Rav, Rabbi Meir Shapiro, sat at the head of the table in his festive silken garment, the enormous fur hat on his head.
He doesn't even call it a Streimer.
Yeah, I love that. That is just so quintessential. You see the distance. Who would call it that in this day? 300 Talmidei Chacham surrounded him, all of them spiritually mature men. There are no words to describe the atmosphere of these hours.
We must point out at this point, Gedalia, that I think me and you, we're still zeiche to see remnants of Chachmei Lublin.
For example,
Rav
Shmuel Wozner,
Rav Hirschsprung, Rav Kreisworth.
Yeah.
And people who haven't seen them cannot they can't fathom like the Torah knowledge of these people. Like today, we hardly see these people who are like bubbling over.
Yeah.
With Shas
I think it was particularly a product of Chachmei Lublin, which insisted
100%.
They had to be makiv. They couldn't sit there and stell over a sugya.
In order to be accepted to Chachmei Lublin,
how many?
400 daf.
400 just to get in.
Right.
Rav
Wosner was not accepted to Chachmei Lublin.
Why?
Because he didn't pass the test.
Rav Wosner didn't make it in.
He didn't make it in. However,
yeah.
Rav Meir Shapiro found him in a corner, sitting and crying.
Yeah.
And he says, someone who has such an avas HaTorah, I'm going to accept it nevertheless.
Unbelievable.
And he became like the major posek in the...
I only heard him once. I met about 20 years ago. I went into a yeshiva Yachel, Chachmei Lublin, as a yeshiva in Bnei Brak, Rav Wosner, and I heard this beautiful... I walked in, everyone's sitting down, and I stood at the back, and I heard this beautiful, clear voice come out.
Right.
But I looked...
The Yiddish was like...
Yeah, but it was like the pronunciation, very clear, very... And then I looked around, I said I couldn't see, I thought it was a recording or something, listening to him. He was sitting down, he was so small, and he was sitting down, I couldn't see him. So,
he was so aristocratic.
Yes,
he was like,
he
was a real like Oberlander from the right.
That's
where he grew up.
Correct. I saw his father's cave just behind the Chotkova Rebbe's cave in Vienna. But
so you have to understand, these are people who knew Shas.
Yeah.
And I remember Rav Kreiser was the first time I heard Rav Kreiser. He was being mastered of Ruderman and Harnoff when I was a young boy, and I came to listen to the Hesped, and he simply closed his eyes.
Kreiser was the Rav of Antwerp.
Of Antwerp. And he was a Talmud of Chachmei Lublin. He closed his eyes, and he was just reading off Gemaras, Baal Peh, Mamish, Mila b'Mila, of Gemaras that talk about Hespedim, about other, Amoraim. It was fascinating. And like you said about Rav Wosner, the sweetness of the way he just read those Gemaras.
Yeah.
These are all products of Chachmei Lublin, because this was a big Kiddush. Because until those days, there was no central yeshiva in Poland at all.
Yeah.
If you had a good Rav in a good town and you had a good shul.
Which is why Hassidic Bachram ended up in Litvish yeshivas.
Right, 100%. And he really made a revolution.
Yeah.
And this is where he's visiting. A place where he says at the table, 300 Talmud Chachamim.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating what he did.
Fascinating. And to hear him, to Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Carlebach, to continue to describe this, I just want to... There's something absolutely unique about Rabbi Carlebach's way of, because he was an outsider and a brilliant man, a Talmud Chacham himself, but coming from an entirely different world, a world where the musik of Gedalim in that way had stopped, had since ceased, long ceased, and he describes, therefore, the series of Rabbanim he met in a way that is, I've never seen anything like this. Listen to this over here. Here in Lublin, we experience for the first time the overpowering strength of the personality. Rav Shapiro is a genius, a brilliant orator and organizer, teacher and leader. The reason that his personality makes such a deep impression is that it is entirely uncomplicated, rooted only in Talmudic Judaism, in the 4 cubits of halacha. Then he says, and I just emphasize this, I think this is so important to hear this, how to analyze
in our day and age.
How
to
analyze, how to read a Talmud Chacham, right? He says, let me continue. It is nothing short of fascinating that in such a strictly circumscribed foundation, meaning such a limited background, no secular knowledge, no world, a modern, free and self-confident individuality can be built and developed. That someone of such posture and disposition, and with a spiritual outlook of very specific Hassidic character, projects a Judaism that is universal without boundaries and circumstances. Rabbi Efraim, what I want to just bring out here is this point. He's picking up on the fact that Rabbi Meir Shapiro was brilliant in the authentic, old-fashioned sense of the word. He was a handsome man with a tremendous presence. You know that picture of him with holding the little
small
Sefer
Torah.
It was a melech, right? He brought that malchus to the Polish parliament the same way he was a member of the parliament. And what is fascinated Rav Yosef Tzvi Carlebach in his objective way is the fact that he is so free and open and powerful and shalida, having grown on nothing but Torah, Dal Damas Halacha and Chassidus. And that's what it is. And I think that I personally find this, and part of the reason why I raised this, I want to talk about this, the single best definition of Torah, or the ability of Torah to elevate that is possible to find, that I've ever read. because that is exactly it. How is something so wide built on something so narrow? That's Torah. It looks narrow, but it contains the world.
And that's so opposite the prevalent way of looking at things today, that in order to be a broad-minded person, you have to have an academic degree, right? In Eretz Yisrael, there's a big milchama about what they call liba.
Liba is the basic core curriculum of the secular curriculum.
Right. But the bottom line is, do those people who learn the core curriculum of the Israeli educational system, do they come out better Jews or better human beings than people who
I think
don't?
they're equipped, it's fair to say, to be programmers, etc. Better than that. I don't think anyone's going to argue that. But I think what he's getting at is the ability of Torah, hafachba v'hafachba, dukulaba.
He's talking about the personality.
Yeah.
Right, building the personality.
Yeah. And, there's bits more, there's quotes over here as he says, to be able to so thoroughly understand his fellow human beings when he desires nothing else but Torah and mitzvahs. Listen to this phrase, such simultaneous breadth and narrowness of the inner soul, this antinomy of the spiritual structure, that is Rav Shlomo Carlebach the son's own English, that is what totally overwhelmed us, impressing itself unforgettably upon our spirit. It is absolutely first class, this. It should be more widely known, and I'm happy we're getting a chance to see it, because it's riveting over here.
The next step on the way is meeting the two giants of Litvish Jewry. We're talking about Rabbi Moshe and the Chofetz Chaim. I once came across a pamphlet. I believe no one had ever seen this pamphlet in the last few years. It was like a printed small pamphlet from a Yortzeit evening dedicated to Rabbi Dr. Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg.
The Srideish.
Right. I think I told you many times before that the Srideish has an adopted son, not officially adopted son, but Srideish had no children.
Right.
And there was a Talmud of his by the name of Shaul Weingart.
Yes.
He brought over the Srideish to Switzerland in order to help him heal
Is
medically.
he not around still?
Oh, right. Shaul Weingart
Yeah.
was a Talmud of the Srideish, probably from the Rabbinic Seminary. And after the war, the Srideish was in a bad matzav medically, health-wise, and he brought him over to Switzerland.
Yeah.
And he took care of him, like with doctors and all that. And he managed to, bring him back to life. And then he was killed in a train accident.
So it's his son.
So his son, now the cards flipped, you understand? Right. The Srideish, adopted the children of Rabbi Shaul Weingart. So his son, Baba Weingart, he organizes once a Yortzeit.
The Srideish.
It's the Srideish. So after one of these evenings, so they printed out a pamphlet of summarizing what they were talking about. Mm-hmm. And one of the speakers there his name was Reb Chaim Lifshitz, who was once a mashgiach in Keren B'Yavne many years ago. And he was he had to be in Switzerland for something. I think he was learning psychology at that time. By Piget, is that right, in Switzerland? And he was like a Yad Yaminoi of the Srideish. And you have to understand, he says, the Srideish was a very critical person.
Yeah.
I mean, you can even see it in his writings. He can talk about someone, but he can point out where
major
he thinks,
flaws.
Right. There's no one above that, right? But when he spoke about the Chofetz Chaim, he had tears in his eyes.
That's what Rav Lifshitz is. Rabbi
Lifshitz. Right. So I once asked the Rav Abba Weingart, what?
Why was the Manishtan of the Chofetz Chaim?
What's going on? So he told me the following story, that he was so moved by the personality of the Chofetz Chaim because of personal encounter that he had with the Chofetz Chaim. So it's worth listening to. He was a young yeshiva bacher, and he was traveling by train, and he asked a few local bums on the train where to get off. And because he didn't understand Russian properly, so he got off at the wrong place, and he was beaten up by some
hoodlums.
And then he decided that he's going to learn Russian. And the Chofetz Chaim heard about it. And the Chofetz Chaim, the next time he came to that area where the Srideish was, he sought him out and he said, bring him in.
But the Srideish was a famous Ilui. And in other words, the Chofetz Chaim felt
17 years old, right.
that he should be focusing not on language, but on Gemara, on learning. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So he said the first thing was that he walked into the room and the Chofetz Chaim got up for him. So the Srideish said, as soon as I saw that, my heart fell. Okay, the Chofetz Chaim had something in mind, and the Chofetz Chaim turned to him and he says, "Do you see all these form over here? Like there's a Choshen and there's a Mishpacha. See all these Sfarim?
Yeah.
Who are they written for? Who's going to learn them? Like the university students are going to learn. Who's going to learn? You're the one that they wrote the Sefer for. Mm. And he took him by his hand and he started crying while he held his hand, and he begged him not to learn Russian, but to focus on Torah learning.
Because he understood that.
By the way, the Sudesh was a professor in, later, I think, Semitic languages, by the way. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if he listened to the Chavetz Chaim's thing, his direction, but he was very impressed by the Chavetz Chaim's sincerity. And as above, Rav Karlbach's descriptions are fascinating. But one more personality of similar power and nobility was on our agenda before the conclusion of our journey. It seems that he was one of the last visits.
Yeah, it's not strictly in the order that it appears.
Right. Rabbi Moshe Grylak, to us, children of the modern world, was perhaps even more important and
consequential
in his uniqueness. While the Chavetz Chaim made us experience a portion of otherworldliness, a sabbatical stillness of eternity, we met in Rabbi Moshe a person who was closer to our level of life. These two great men could, in a certain sense, be compared one to another as to Yemos HaMashiach.
Rabbi Efraim, this is unparalleled stuff. I've often felt it's a failing of the way that we write biographies and that we talk about Gedalia Yisrael. In the end, they all sound the same. And that is such a cliche that it's talk about a cliche about a cliche. But it's something we must overcome because you see it can be done. Look at the genius of that. Look how penetrating that insight is. To compare Chaim Oizer to Yemos HaMashiach, what's the difference between Yemos HaMashiach and Olam Haba? Is that Yemos HaMashiach is, Chazal say, the world will continue, as the Rambam says, the world will continue as before. It will just be on an elevated plane, but the physical reality will remain the same.
Shibud Malchus Bilvad, that's
correct.
What it says, right.
And so that is Chaim Oizer, the ability to totally be in this world and be a normal human being and yet be elevated. Whereas the Chavetz Chaim was this taste of Olam Haba, right, which is a supernatural or existence of holiness that is not of this world. That is a remarkable and startling insight.
100%. If you allow me, I once interviewed a very important figure in yeshiva history, right? And that is, you probably know the name, Reb Jackie Levison.
From London.
He was a Yad Yaminoi of the Panovich Rav for many years when the Panovich Rav came to London to raise funds for Panovich. And I had the privilege of sitting with him and Rabbi Menachem Cohen, the head of the rabbinical board for the Hebrew Mishpacha.
Yeah.
And they're friends from way back. And
the beginning of Panovich.
Right. And we sat there for probably over an hour, maybe close to 2 hours, speaking about his discussions with the Panovich Rav. And the Panovich Rav spoke about the Chavetz Chaim. And he said, it's a long story. I'm not going to tell you the whole story we heard over there. But one thing was very interesting. He said that the Chavetz Chaim was like a malach. Okay? And he gave an example. He says, when we used to sit in meetings with Gedalia and with Chavetz Chaim, the Chavetz Chaim would actually read our minds. And he would point to each one sitting at the table.
Yeah.
And he would tell them something that they were thinking about.
Was that a party trick? I mean, what was the point?
For some reason, he was giving them like orders in his way of doing it. But he says we felt that he knew what was going on in our minds.
That was the Panovich Rav
talking about the Chavetz Chaim.
Who was a big person himself. Who was a very big person himself. Rabbi Efraim, I think that the highlight of this diary, and to me the most moving thing, it's actually printed on the back page of the dust jacket of this issue hoodie, was the song, the shira, the ode, the praise of Rav Yosef Tzvi Carlebach to the yeshiva, to the life of Torah and the life of being immersed in Limud Torah. And this, given who he was, given his stature and given his position, and the fact that he could have said, no, our way is correct. Or maybe he did feel as a Hirschian that our way is correct, but he was able to recognize something unique and beautiful and unrivaled in the Torah world of Eastern Europe. This was a rabbi who was so busy. We know in the book over here, the issue, he says how his father did not have time to prepare his brilliant darshan. He did not have a minute to prepare his drashas, and he said you could see when he was beginning to prepare his drashas, which is, I think he spoke before Kriyas Torah, after Kriyas Torah, I don't remember which one it was, but when they were busy putting the Sefer Torah in or out,
that's when he had time to...
He said that's when and he would quote verbatim Midrashim and Gemaras and ideas, and it was beautiful stuff. And it was all, he didn't have time. He was just too busy running, because what happened, became increasingly, as the 30s went on, less and less, fewer and fewer Rabbanim were left in Germany, and he was the Rav of first Hamburg, and then, or was the other way around, Altona, the Hamburg and Wandsbek, and the Rabbanim of one of the only big Rabbanim left, and as the crises of German Jewry mounted, he was one of the last addresses. So you can understand he didn't have time. I'm not sure he taught Daf Yomi, whatever it was. But that is what makes this so beautiful over here.
That even someone of such stature would use the word mispoil.
Correct. He says like this of the yeshivas that he saw. The secret of this Jewish energy, the key to understanding its ability to conquer the power of the bayonet and the whip, of alluring fad and fashion, which was obviously the glitter of Western Europe, of the good life and comforts, of the glittering civilization, the social acclimatization, is the same in all 4 countries visited. Very interestingly. He's giving a summary of everything he saw. Lithuania and Poland and Russia and Pressburg. Namely, the learning of Torah. And now listen to this. Young and old, rich and poor, everyone is learning constantly, totally immersed, living and breathing the Torah, be it the written or oral one, just as the Yiddish language is interwoven, their Yiddish language. Remember, in Western Europe, they don't speak Yiddish. Is interwoven and intermingled with idioms and phrases from the Talmud. So is their very life pulsating and throbbing with the echo of sacred writ.
This is very interesting, because if you're talking about the time, the period of history that he's visiting Eastern Europe,
Yep.
This is already after the secularization takes hold of the Jewish...
Correct, 1929.
Right, and
it's on his way out.
Right, and he still feels it.
He still feels it.
He still feels
I think,
the fact that everyone is sitting and learning.
Well, I think, look, first of all, he's visiting yeshiva towns. He's visiting Vilna.
You're saying that's where everything is concentrated.
He's going to ground zero. He's going to the places. He's not going to little villages where it's dying out. He's not going to... He's going to the places where it's... You know, you have this introduction to the who is it, the Piasetzner Rebbe, the Eish Kodesh, his introduction to his work, Chovas HaTalmidim. Fascinatingly, he says, people come and say, what are you complaining about? That the Torah is going, the Batim Medrash are full, everything. And he writes in the introduction, have you stepped outside the Beis Medrash in Warsaw? Don't you understand? Inside there's the vibrant Torah world. Everything's fine. Outside is death and desolation. Right, and that's what it was. If you were inside Mir, if you were inside the Beis Medrash in Telz, you could ignore the fact that
but how many people from each village came to...
The civilization, as Rabbi Zatzal told me, he says that his father was a Talmud of Rosh Mishkop, and Rosh Mishkop said during the 20s, I'm going to America. He traveled to America because he wanted to take his yeshiva there. He said, the Torah world of Eastern Europe is finished.
Wow.
It's finished. The future is in America, he told him, as Berwine said. Most incredible thing, he said, because the poverty, and the reason was poverty and the isms, all the isms that were driving, it was the incredible poverty. And what had happened, so it's not a surprise. These two things coexisted. Things were going rapidly downhill, but fighting back inside the Beis Medrash was tremendous light, tremendous energy, and still the ancient Torah civilization. It's worth reading a bit more of his. He says, for us, Hebrew is a foreign tongue, as is German to a Frenchman. To them, in contrast, it is the mother tongue, every simpleton's talk, as natural to children's babble as to mature people's talk. Then he says like this, to them, the Torah is not a lesson in religion, but the very wisdom of life, the living spirit which penetrates every fiber of existence.
I think we go back to what I asked you in the beginning of this chapter, was what did he find in Eastern Europe that he didn't have in Germany? And I think this is the Nakuda.
Yeah.
The Nakuda is that Torah is their life. And without getting into details, I can tell you I was visiting a different community. Very fine people, but there's a difference, okay? Just as a side point, okay? I'm accustomed where I'm coming from, Motzei Shabbos, you continue Shalosh Shudas for 15, 20 minutes after the Zman, you'll find plenty of minyanim, right? I go to a place, another community, With numbers-wise, there are enough people there, believe me. 20 minutes after Shabbos is over, no minyanim left. And I came to the realization that there are some places where Yiddishkeit plays a central role, or it's something that has to be done, and let's move on. Motzei Shabbos comes around, let's get it over with.
So, I mean, in that vein, you have what I would say is a summary. The thrust of what Rav Carlebach is saying was contrasting the richness of the Torah culture of Eastern Europe versus the poverty of that culture in Germany and Western Europe, in which become cut off from the life source and the mainstream. And people then were spoon-fed small doses of Torah with large doses of Derech Eretz. And I think that will be the strongest defenders and advocates of the Yekshua world will say that. But I think that is the very, very interesting, and the honest take of Rav Yosef Tzvi Carlebach over here. And just to finish off this over here with one extremely powerful phrase that sums up what a yeshiva is. Rabbi Efraim, what do you think of this? He says, it is a quasi-people's university, the yeshiva, to which no diploma guarantees admission, which is open to anyone to come and go if he identifies with the high republic of the Jewish spirit and is capable of exchanging thoughts and arguments with Abaya and Rava. I want to end off with the fact that this all sounds, Rabbi Efraim, this is very patronizing. It's just the Germans coming along, being wowed by the Eastern Europe. Okay, I think it was more of a two-way street over here. Rabbi Efraim, I think if you just pause or end the episode here, we see a very beautiful song, a song of praise of a very great and an honest outsider and thinker of the yeshiva world and or let's say of the more broadly of the Eastern European pre-war Torah world.
Sometimes you need someone to come from the outside.
Correct.
And give you a fresh observation.
And that is what this is. But I think, in all fairness, it's more. Because what actually happened, if you look at the diary, what you're seeing is that it was actually more of a two-way street. The pictures that we show, the Gedalia of Eastern Europe, coming out, Chaim Moiser, Meir Shapiro, the Gedalia to these delegations from Western Europe, I don't think they were just after their money. Or, wow, we have to be makar of them. I think that, as Rabbi Carlebach himself notes, there's this incredible line of Rabbi Efraim, which he says, Carlebach says, that at a certain point, the discoverers became the discovery. In other words, it was clear to him that the Gedolim of Eastern Europe and the organizers of Eastern Europe didn't just see them as fundraisers or targets for Kiruv, etc. They recognized that there's some unique value that the Jews of Western Europe, the Orthodox Jews of Western Europe, had to bring to the table. And we talked about that before. I think that if I want to summarize things, I would say that whereas the Jews of Eastern Europe brought the immersion in Torah, the yeshiva civilization, the great spiritual center of gravity, the Jews of the West had worked out and brought to the table structure, organization, institutional thinking.
Which was now crucial in Eastern Europe, because different forces were coming in.
Because the same forces that had laid waste in Western Europe were now assaulting, and that's a subject for another time. But I think very clearly, as we said at the beginning, what we take for granted are the enormous frum infrastructure that we see today. We don't move anywhere. It's almost like with this amazing invading army, the frum world comes to a new place. What does it do straight away? Well, we need yeshivas, Beis Yaakovs, kolim, Chesed organizations, lobbying groups to deal with the local government, professionalized moisters. We tend to think of these things as ancient and continuous, but they weren't, because they were in truth a marriage of West and East. And somehow, after the ashes of Europe, those strands fused into the phoenix-like rebirth of the Torah world that surrounds us today.
Beautiful, Gedalia.
Rabbi Efraim, because this is really not about analysis, it is about the beautiful words of Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Carlebach, this Adam Gadol, a Gavar Rabba, who died al Kiddush Hashem. How I think it's appropriate just to end with just a few last lines of his kind of love song and poetry for Torah learning itself. Because he says like this, and excuse me if I quote from this, just to bear with, but I think that it's worth it. He says, "Oh, blissful world of the yeshiva, your spicy, invigorating air makes my chest swell, my pulse beat faster. You fortress of Torah with open doors and wide open windows, you great source of comfort to Israel. Who feels in your arena the world's agony? Who asks about cradle or parental home, about age or status, name or origin? All differences among people disappear like useless scales. O paradise of joy, where one feels so enriched, so fulfilled, so world-transcending. Only those who study merge into harmonious, resounding choir, the song of the waves, or the rolling seas of the Jewish spirit, he continues. Beautiful. In this chorus, no one voice stands out, yet one hears the all-conquering, all-humbling voice of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Rabbi Akiva, of Rambam and Rashi. And then these last words, which you can imagine he took with him, all those words back to Germany, where he would go through the Hitler years, make the brave decision to stay behind, and eventually would go with his community after death. He says, it still resounds in my ears, that roaring, stormy sing-song, like breakers of sound waves upon the rock of Torah, being gripped by longing for that station of life-affirming world oblivion, of those fortunate ones who retreat from the world without loathing, that it elucidates and illuminates the labyrinth of the Jewish heart.
Beautiful, Rabbi Gedalia.
Thank you for listening to Behind the Times. We appreciate you joining us as we explore the stories and people that shape Jewish history. If you enjoy this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with friends. Until next time.